What happens when the most powerful man in the world tells a joke and the entire room goes dead silent? Not polite silence, not awkward chuckles, complete total broadcast to the nation silence. That is exactly what happened on July 24th, 2026 at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And 4 days later, Jon Stewart made sure the country would never forget it. The Waldorf Astoria was packed with the most powerful journalists in America. Black tie, cameras rolling. The one night of the year when a sitting president is supposed to roast the press, take a few punches back, and prove he can laugh at himself. Donald Trump stepped to the microphone and went straight at CNN's Caitlin Collins. He complained that her award was all about him, that the coverage was fake, that she shouldn't have received it. Then he turned to her face. She's a young, attractive woman. She never smiles. The big punchline came next. Trump claimed he thought Collins had landed a major sponsorship deal, only to inform her that the person on the Bud Light can wasn't her at all. It was Dylan Mulvaney. In a room full of professional communicators, people who have politely laughed through decades of mediocre presidential jokes, the response was nothing. No laughter, no groans, no polite recovery noise, just silence. A silence so complete that multiple news outlets treated the non-reaction itself as the story. Presidents bomb at these dinners all the time. What almost never happens is a joke landing with such pure emptiness that the emptiness becomes the headline. Caitlin Collins did not fire back in the room. Later, she posted a calm Instagram message quoting Eleanor Roosevelt about never letting others make you feel inferior. Dylan Mulvaney went further. She refused to accept the insult as a wound. Instead, she thanked Trump for reminding her how free and powerful she actually was. Neither woman gave him the reaction the joke was built to create. The room had already given him something rarer and far more damaging, total silence, and that silence is what Jon Stewart picked up 4 nights later and turned into one of the cleanest exposures of the year, July 28th, 2026. Jon Stewart sat behind the Daily Show desk and performed the service he has delivered more consistently and more precisely than almost anyone else in American media. He did not invent material. He did not escalate into personal invective. He simply played the tape of the Correspondents' Dinner and let the silence do the heaviest lifting. Stewart isolated the moment Trump seemed to lose the thread of his own bit while delivering it. "Oh my God, don't tell us you're changing the target of your roast joke halfway through." On a separate joke aimed at former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, Stewart offered a dry diagnosis. "Who the hell wrote that line? It sounds like you." The implication was clear. Either Trump had written the material himself or he had approved lines that no professional comedy writer would have allowed a president to deliver in that setting. The deeper cut went beyond individual punchlines. Stewart argued that Trump has lived for so long inside a self-reinforcing environment of flattery and pre-selected audiences that he has lost the ability to recognize what is actually funny to a room that does not already agree with him. The Correspondents' Dinner audience, independent, professional, and under no obligation to perform enthusiasm, had provided the clearest possible evidence. The silence was not a failure of the room. It was a failure of calibration. White House Correspondents' Dinners are structurally forgiving. The audience understands the ritual. They have sat through decades of uneven presidential material and still offered the minimum professional courtesy of a reaction. When even that courtesy is withheld, the material has not merely underperformed, it has actively misread the people sitting in front of it. Stewart held the camera on that misreading and declined to let it be softened or rewritten. The Correspondents' Dinner did not occur in isolation. Within a tight 2-week window, 2 additional public moments displayed the same underlying inability to meet the emotional and social demands of the setting. The first was the Meet the Press walkout. Faced with sustained, unscripted questioning of the kind the program has specialized in for decades, Trump physically left the interview rather than continue. Stewart's 3-word description, "incredibly fragile man baby," traveled widely because it named something observable. A president who invests heavily in the performance of strength could not tolerate the ordinary discomfort of adversarial scrutiny on a broadcast designed for exactly that purpose. Walking out of Meet the Press is not a minor breach of decorum. It is a public demonstration that the cost of appearing unable to handle hard questions was judged lower than the cost of simply enduring them. The second moment followed the death of South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham. Trump called into Fox and Friends to offer a tribute. What emerged instead was a recollection of phone calls that had annoyed him, a critique of Graham's golf swing, and an explicit numerical rating 99 out of 100 based specifically on Graham's position regarding January 6th. A moment that called for some form of reflection on a long and complicated political relationship became a personal scorecard centered on Trump's own grievances and standards of loyalty. Stewart's response was characteristically direct. He observed that the president appeared to have moved through the traditional stages of grief at high speed and arrived at a sixth stage of his own, "Fuck that guy." He compared the numerically graded eulogy to a pizza review format, a structure built for ranking consumer products, applied without adjustment to a human life and a working relationship that had spanned years of public alliance and public conflict. The comparison was crude by design. It identified the category error at the center of the tribute, treating a moment of loss as an opportunity for content scoring. 3 settings. 1 formal dinner requiring humor and some measure of self-awareness. 1 flagship interview requiring composure under pressure. 1 death requiring at least a basic register of solemnity. In each case, the same reflex surfaced. The moment was pulled back toward personal grievance, self-reference, and a striking failure to read what the room or the occasion actually required. The White House Correspondents' Dinner has long performed a quiet but real institutional function. It serves as an annual, ritualized demonstration that the adversarial relationship between the press and the presidency can still coexist with shared space, mutual ribbing, and an underlying acknowledgement that the adversarial posture itself is healthy rather than purely personal. When that ritual produces total silence instead of reciprocal humor, and when the targets of the material respond with composure rather than visible injury, the event stops functioning as pressure release and begins functioning as evidence of strain. Stewart's effectiveness has never depended on manufacturing new outrage. It depends on the opposite discipline, returning the audience's attention to something that already occurred in full public view and trusting them to recognize it without heavy embellishment. A presidential joke that dies in complete silence does not require additional commentary to qualify as a failure. A president who cannot complete a tough interview without physically leaving does not require elaborate framing to appear thin-skinned. A eulogy that pivots to golf criticism and a loyalty-based numerical score does not require exaggeration to register as strange. What Stewart reliably supplies is the refusal to allow these moments to be absorbed and rewritten by the permanent communications apparatus that surrounds the presidency. That apparatus is efficient. Within hours, a friendlier version of each episode is usually available. The Correspondents' Dinner material was edgy and simply misunderstood. The Meet the Press exit was a principled refusal to dignify a hostile line of questioning. The Graham tribute was blunt, unsparing honesty rather than self-centered scorekeeping. Stewart's recurring contribution is to keep the original record visible long enough that the rewritten version cannot fully replace it in public memory. The question he keeps asking, sometimes explicitly, sometimes simply by replaying the tape, is the same one. Did that actually go the way you think it did? By the close of the July 28 Daily Show monologue, the exposure was already complete and required no further invention. A sitting president had stood before the White House press corps, delivered material that targeted a correspondent's physical demeanor, and then yoked her without prompt to a years-old culture war figure, and received the rarest response that room can offer: unbroken silence. 4 days later, the most precise critic in American political comedy replayed the moment, diagnosed the insulation that had produced it, and set it beside the interview walkout and the strange numerical eulogy as 3 data points in the same pattern. Trump retained every conventional tool of response: posts, claims of strength, assertions that the jokes had landed differently than the silence indicated, reframing of the walkout as resolve and the eulogy as candor. What those tools could not easily erase was the public sequence itself. 3 consecutive high-stakes settings in which the register the occasion demanded, humor calibrated to the actual audience, composure under unscripted pressure, and basic solemnity in the face of a colleague's death, had been replaced by the same self-referential reflex. Stewart did not need to create a feud. He did not need to match volume with volume. He only needed to decline to look away from what the cameras had already recorded and to keep the original tape from being overwritten. The dinner produced silence. The interview produced a walkout. The tribute produced a scorecard. At the end of the segment, Jon Stewart was left in the position he has occupied more effectively than almost anyone else this year, holding up the unedited record and asking the country to notice the gap between the performance and the reception. Did that actually go the way you think it did? Once the silence was allowed to remain audible, the answer did not require additional persuasion. It was already there in the room. In the days after Jon Stewart replayed the correspondence dinner tape, the silence from that black tie room refused to fade the way ordinary political stumbles usually do. Most presidential missteps are quickly buried under the next news cycle, softened by friendly coverage, or reframed by the White House communications apparatus into something that sounds intentional. This one proved harder to bury. The original moment had been too clean. A full room of professional journalists had given a sitting president nothing. No laughter, no polite recovery, no audible reaction of any kind. Stewart had simply held the camera on that nothing and asked the country to notice it. Once noticed, the silence became difficult to unsee. The attempted reframes arrived on schedule. Some voices claimed the material had been edgy and that the press corps was simply too thin-skinned to appreciate it. Others suggested the lack of reaction was itself a form of bias, proof that the room had decided in advance not to give Trump any grace. A few tried to argue that the joke had actually landed in certain corners of the internet, even if the live audience had stayed quiet. None of these efforts fully succeeded in replacing the original record. The tape still showed a room that had chosen not to respond. Stewart's monologue still sat beside that tape, calmly diagnosing the insulation that had produced the miscalculation. What made the moment stick was not only the failed joke itself, it was the way it fit a larger pattern that Stewart had been documenting for months. The same inability to read a room that was not already predisposed to agree had shown up in the Meet the Press walkout and in the strangely self-centered Lindsey Graham tribute. 3 different settings, 3 different emotional requirements, humor, composure under pressure, basic solemnity, and the same reflex each time. The moment was pulled back toward personal grievance and self-reference. The correspondence dinner silence was simply the cleanest and most public example of the pattern. Inside the broader media conversation, the episode began to function as a reference point rather than a one-off embarrassment. Commentators who rarely agreed on policy found themselves acknowledging the same observable fact. A president who spends enormous energy projecting dominance had stood in front of the White House press corps and completely misjudged the temperature of the room. The targets of the joke, Caitlin Collins and Dylan Mulvaney, had both refused to supply the wounded reaction that would have given the material a second life. Their composure left the silence undisturbed. Stewart's decision to replay the moment without heavy embellishment left it undisturbed as well. This created a practical problem for the permanent reframing machinery that surrounds the presidency. That machinery works best when a moment can be contested or when a more favorable interpretation can be repeated until it feels true. Silence is difficult to contest. It does not argue back. It simply remains visible on the tape. Every new attempt to describe the evening as a success or a misunderstood edge had to compete with the unedited record of a room that had given the president nothing. The more the alternative versions circulated, the more clearly the original silence stood out against them. By the end of the following week, the correspondence dinner had settled into a quieter but more durable status. It was no longer the loudest story of the day. It had become something more useful to Stewart's larger project, a clean, publicly documented example of a president operating inside a feedback loop so complete that he could no longer accurately predict how an independent audience would receive him. The joke itself was minor. The misreading of the room was not. And because Stewart had declined to turn the moment into a personal feud or a partisan rallying cry, the observation remained available to anyone who simply watched the tape. The silence had done its work in the room on July 24th. Stewart had made sure it continued doing its work afterward. He did not need to invent new material or escalate the conflict. He only needed to keep the original moment from being overwritten. In a media environment saturated with spin, that act of refusal, the simple insistence on letting the record stand, proved more damaging than most direct attacks. The president could still claim the jokes had landed. He could still insist the press had been unfair. He could still move on to the next controversy. What he could not easily do was make the silence disappear. Once a room full of journalists has given a sitting president nothing, and once that nothing has been held up to the light by someone who refuses to look away, the moment stops belonging only to the evening it occurred. It becomes evidence. And evidence, unlike a joke that dies in silence, does not need laughter to survive.